Welcome to the Crowned for Ministry podcast, where leadership, growth, and authenticity come together. I'm your host, Josh McElhaney, and we're here to empower you to live out your calling, grow in your faith, and lead with purpose. Let's dive into real-life challenges and discover what it means to be crowned for ministry. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Crown for Ministry podcast. I'm your host, Josh McElhaney, and I'm really excited to have you with me on this podcast today. From the very onset of this episode, I want to start by saying one thing very clear. You are listening to this podcast because you have a calling on your life. Yes, you. Now, maybe you think that you're just listening to this by chance. Maybe you feel like this is something that you stumbled upon. You may have saw a link to it somewhere, and you clicked on it just to support me getting started here with this podcast. But whether you realize it or not, God has uniquely crafted a purpose, a destiny that only you can feel. But here's the kicker. There are those of us who have been called to ministry, and we're sure of that calling, but stepping and walking into that calling doesn't always mean going straight into a position of authority or basking in the recognition we think we deserve. You see, God's kingdom operates a little differently than what we're used to. You see, true greatness isn't always found in the spotlight. And for our flesh, that's really hard for us to hear, but sometimes greatness is cultivated in the shadows. The journey from being called to being appointed is rarely immediate. Very few people receive a call from God in their lives to do something and then wake up the next day walking in that season of life that God has called them to. Most of us, the waiting period between the anointing and the appointing is usually marked by seasons of waiting, seasons of challenges, and moments where you wonder if God even remembers the promises He made you. And I'm here to tell you that, yes, He does. You see, because in those seasons, the waiting, the challenges, the frustration, those are not wasted times. They're preparation, preparing you for what God is trying to do in you so that He can work through you. Let's think about King David. He was anointed king, right? But you see, instead of stepping into a throne in the palace, David is running for his life. Saul's trying to kill him, and he's now hiding in a cave. Now, that's a plot twist if I've ever seen one. But you see, here's the thing. David's time in the cave was not a detour from his destiny. No, to the contrary, it was part of his destiny. It was where God refined David and shaped him into the king that he was meant to be. You see, in the cave, it wasn't about prominence or power. It was about preparation. And that's a lesson for all of us. Now, without question, there's probably some of you listening right now who feel like you're in a cave season in this moment. Like you're hidden, unseen, unrecognized. Maybe you're wondering, God, what about that calling you placed on my life? What about the dreams I've been carrying? When's it my turn? And trust me, I've been there, and I've been there more than once in my life. I've walked through that cave, and let me tell you something. Although it may feel like it, the cave is not a curse. It's the place where your calling and your identity in Christ is being formed. Now, I want to share a little bit of my own journey with you today, and I've been pretty open and transparent in talking through the Narcissistic Christianity book But I want to take you back to the very beginning of my ministry when I wrote my first book, King in the Cave. Now, some of you listening are probably familiar with this book, and this book was written after a very pivotal moment in my life, and it's resonated with a lot of people who have been serving faithfully in obscurity, far from the recognition, from the spotlights that they may have envisioned for themselves. Now, I want to dive into something that shaped my entire journey, something that started with a revelation I had while serving under my first pastor. You see, when I first began to understand my calling, I thought it would look a lot differently. I was one of the rare ones in Bible college who didn't have any aspirations for evangelizing. I didn't have any aspirations to go out and preach a lot of conferences, to travel the world. I knew in my spirit that God had called me to something unique. At that time, I just knew that God had called me to go back to my home church, and eventually God was leading me to pastor. But still, there were things in my mind that I had envisioned and dreams that I had for myself that I thought God was going to bring to pass in my life. You see, in my younger years, I thought that leadership was all about stepping into positions of power and influence. I thought it was about receiving the accolades and standing in the spotlight and leading from this very prominent place. But God had a much deeper lesson to teach me. It was through the story of David. You see, the year was 2015. I had made plans to attend a large conference called Because of the Times in Alexandria, Louisiana. At this point, I had been in ministry for about a decade, and I was doing everything I could to pursue the call of God in my life. I had left Bible college in 2007. I had gotten married at that point. I had gone back to my home church, and I was serving faithfully in this church. I was teaching Bible studies. I was preaching when given the opportunity. I was leading service. I was leading departments. I was being used by God where I was. But in the meantime, on social media, I was watching friends and colleagues who had gone to college with rise to positions of leadership. I saw friends that were traveling the world, some going out into missions trips, some becoming missionaries. I saw friends of mine pastoring churches, and there I was, feeling stuck. I was still serving in my home church, and I felt overlooked and forgotten, if we're being honest. I was so frustrated in this season. I'll be very honest. I kept asking God during the season. I'd see a post somewhere, and that frustration would overwhelm me again, and I would say, God, when is it going to be my turn? But God didn't give me the answer I expected. Instead, he gave me the story of David. Now, it was interesting because in this conference, and Because of the Times, I went actually a day early, and they had, I believe, one of the first split sessions. I haven't been in several years, so I'm not sure if it's even something that still happens now, but this was the first year they had done a type of split session before the conference, and this was the morning of the first night of the conference. And one of the split sessions that I attended was called Leading from Down Under. And the minister who was leading this session had been a long-time assistant pastor, and he was speaking from that experience. And as I sat there, I noticed that this frustration that I was feeling, it wasn't just me. There was several young ministers in this split session, and when he opened it up for question and answers, some of the questions that came back were startling. A lot of frustrations and a lot of people wrestling with this kind of inner turmoil, with the conflict that was going on between being called or being anointed and being appointed. And so it was in this split session that God began to really speak to me and began to move on my spirit the contents that would eventually become my first book, King in the Cave. You see, as I was sitting there and throughout the subsequent services, as I began to pray, God just began to move on me, and it was just overwhelming. And what God showed me was King David, who was called to be king, spending all these years in a cave, hiding out and fearing for his life. And what God showed me through the story of David was that it was in the cave where David developed the skills and the influence that would serve him when he sat on the throne as king. But what God showed me is that David didn't become king when he sat on the throne. David was acting and walking as a king in the cave. And so here I was, faithfully serving my pastor, and God began to unveil to me the true purpose of leadership. It was through this story of David's time in the cave of Adullam that I realized something profound. True leadership isn't about sitting on a throne. It's about letting God shape us in those hidden places. In that cave, David wasn't leading from a position of power. He wasn't ruling from some throne. He was a leader simply because of his heart of service, his humility, and his willingness to be used by God in the shadows of that cave. And that's when it clicked for me. You see, God often shapes us in the shadows before ever bringing us into the light. He refines us in those moments when no one's watching, preparing us to serve in ways that reflect His purpose and not our own ambitions. And that revelation hit me hard. It was like God was saying to me, Josh, I'm not shaping you for a throne. I'm shaping you in the cave, and that's just as important. And from that moment of clarity, King in the Cave was born. And it wasn't just a project. It was the fulfillment of the preparation that God had been working in me all those years. I embraced that ministry wholeheartedly, realizing that influence doesn't come from a title. It comes from serving, from empowering others, and from walking in humility. Now, the response to King in the Cave was beyond anything I could have ever comprehended. The book sold out rapidly. Thousands of copies were distributed around the world, and I heard from pastors I had never met reaching out to me asking for 20 and 30 copies to be sent to their churches so that they could train their young leaders. I had a pastor reach out to me via social media asking if he could use my book in Bible classes. This book made its way into Bible colleges overseas where it was being used to train future leaders. This overwhelming response confirmed something that I had been reluctant to learn, but God was showing me all along. Influence isn't defined by the positions we hold. It's defined by the service we give, by the lives we touch, and by the way we reflect God's heart. And I would love to tell you that from that moment forward, man, I just walked lock and step with God, and everything has been perfect, but it wasn't. You see, 2 years after publishing that book, in 2017, I was elected as pastor of the church that I've been serving in for over a decade. It was a moment I had dreamed of for years, going all the way back to 2005, when I walked onto the campus of Texas Bible College, and I felt that call to ministry, and I felt that burden for pastoring. This was that moment I had been dreaming of and waiting for and praying for, all those seasons of frustration where I cried out to God and asked when my turn was coming. My turn had finally come, and I was finally having the throne that I had longed for. It was an incredible experience, and to this day, one of the greatest experiences of my life was being privileged enough to pastor those wonderful people in that church. What God did through us and in that community can never be replicated. I'm just so grateful and thrilled for everything that happened. But in that season, the church was thriving. And from the outside, it looked like everything in my life had fallen into place. Our church was growing. I published my second book. I traveled overseas to minister at a men's conference in Chile. I was being asked to speak out at several different rallies and conferences, and I was really living my dreams of ministry at this point. And if we're being honest, I really thought I had arrived. And in 2019, that dream came crashing down due to the revelation of my ex-wife's affair. I was forced to resign from a church I thought I would retire at. Remember, when I wrote King in the Cave, I thought that book was a preparation for ministry. I had served over 10 years in my cave, preparing me for this moment. I had finally sat upon the throne that God had called me to, and now I'm having to give it all up for something I didn't even do. It was one of the hardest moments of my life. And over the next few years, I would experience a roller coaster of emotion. I had some highs and I had a lot of lows and everything in between. And I tried to remain faithful, tried to cling to the purpose that God had given me. But the truth was this: I felt further from the purpose that God had given me than I had ever been in my life. I'm talking about further from being connected to what God had called me to do than I was in 2014 and 15 at the pinnacle of my frustration as a young minister. I was consumed by my desire to get back to that throne and to reclaim what I thought was my rightful place of ministry. It was eating me alive. But fast forward to 2023, a very pivotal year in my life, a year marked by frustration and intense prayer, a year of a challenging journey where I became frustrated and in some ways bitter with God for how my life had gone and where I was in regard to my ministry. I began reflecting again on my purpose and through counseling and through a lot of prayer, a lot of fasting, seeking after God, God began to work in me again. And it was during that season that God began to reveal to me the narcissistic traits that I had, which led to me writing my book, Narcissistic Christianity. And it changed everything for my life, for my mindset. The writing of that book was transformational. You see, for years, I had viewed King in the Cave as a prequel to the throne. I mean, after all, when David faithfully served in the cave, the next place for David to go was on the throne. And so for me, King in the Cave was just a stepping stone to the throne that God had called me to. But what I discovered during the season of reflection was this: that the cave was not a preliminary phase of ministry, but instead the cave was the heart of my calling. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. Almost 10 years after writing King in the Cave, and 2 decades into my ministry, God was revealing to me that my calling was never about sitting on a throne. It was always about the cave. Now, that doesn't mean that I was never supposed to be the pastor of the church I pastored, because that's not what this is really about. But years after I resigned, I was lamenting the loss of that throne, thinking that I was supposed to be there and that my ministry was not flourishing the way God had designed it to flourish unless I was sitting there. But you see, while I was going through this season of frustration, God was trying to realign my faith and my vision and pull me back to the very place I had resisted all along, and that was the cave. Because here's the truth, whether I sit on a literal throne or not, I wear a crown of ministry. And my purpose isn't tied to a position. It's tied to the heart of my service, the humility that comes from being willing to embrace the obscurity that is the cave. And that's something far greater than personal ambition. It's a purpose that transcends anything I could have ever imagined for myself. And so today, I walk in that purpose. I'm not defined by a throne or the lack thereof. I'm not defined by what title is next to my name, but by the crown that God has placed on my head through my service to Him in the cave. And maybe, just maybe, you're in that same place today. Perhaps you're waiting for the next step in your ministry, the next position, that recognition that you've been longing for somebody to see in you what you feel in your spirit. But I want to encourage you as you listen to this to embrace where you are right now. And for some of you, it may not be easy. But whether you're in a boardroom, whether you're in a classroom, or yes, whether you're even in a cave feeling overlooked and forgotten, God is preparing you. And a title will not define your calling. Your calling will be defined by your faithfulness, your heart to serve, and your willingness to be shaped by Him, even in the hard places that He calls us to. And so throughout this podcast, we're going to dive into what it really means to lead in God's kingdom. We're going to explore stories of biblical leaders, people who were anointed but had to wait for their appointment. We're going to talk about the power of alignment and how to lead from under authority, how to wield influence without chasing titles. We're going to face the challenges of discouragement and impatience head on, and most importantly, we're going to discover what it means to be crowned for ministry, whether or not you ever wear an actual crown or sit on an actual throne. We're going to interview people who have stories that will resonate with you, people who have overcome, people who have faced challenges in their ministries and are now seeing the other side of the shaping and the preparation that they had to experience in the cave. You see, I truly believe that God has something incredible for you, even if you don't feel like you're in the spotlight right now. You may be thinking, me, how in the world will I ever do anything for God from where I'm standing right now? I've been serving, I've been faithful, I've been working, I've been laboring, I've been doing everything I can. And I'm here to first and foremost to congratulate you for your faithfulness to God, to tell you thank you for serving, even when it's a thankless job, to say, I am proud of you for waking up every day, going to your church, serving, teaching those Bible studies, leading those services, teaching those Sunday school classes, whatever it is that God has you doing. It may not be what you envisioned in your mind when God called you, but this is where God has placed you, and you're doing it with all your might and with all your soul, with all your strength, and I applaud you for that. Let's take this journey together. Let's discover what it means to serve faithfully and to lead with humility, because what you don't see right now is that you are building something and that God is working through you and in you so that He can use you for His purpose, and so that when it's all said and done, it will be God that gets the glory and not you, your flesh, or your ambitions. I want you to step into the purpose that God has for you, whether you're in a cave or whether you're on a throne. God has something incredible in store for you and for your ministry. I want to thank you so much for tuning in today. And if this message and this episode resonated with you, please don't forget to subscribe, share it with someone who might need a little encouragement. If you haven't already, please check out my book, King in the Cave. Also, you can check out my book, Narcissistic Christianity. And until next time, stay blessed and stay crowned.